Amen. For the time that is ours to share this morning, I'd like to talk to us from the thought, a gospel to be proud of. A gospel to be proud of.
Yes. All right, man. All right.
Amen. I've got some good news and I've got some bad news for you this morning. Which one do you want first? The bad news or the good news? The bad? The good? Just the good news? I'll give you the bad news first. The bad news is that LeBron James has signed and agreed to sign a 4-year, $154 million contract with the Lakers.
Good news. That's the good news.
The good news is that the Los Angeles Lakers are relevant again.
Amen. That's good news too.
Well,
You ain't said no bad news yet, man. Come on.
that may both. That may be good news for you or bad news for you. And the truth is that I'm not a big LeBron fan as a basketball player.
Okay, all right.
I like him as a person,
Yeah.
but as a basketball player, I still got some mixed feelings about him coming and playing for my Los Angeles Lakers. My Lakers. That's my team. You know, I'm not a bandwagon team.
Yeah. All right, real.
But the truth be told,
Come on, Real. Come on.
we all love to hear good news.
Amen.
We all love to hear good news about someone finding some money. We all love good news about someone getting a new job. We all love to hear good news about someone getting a promotion. We all love to hear good news about someone getting married or someone getting engaged. We all love to hear good news about someone getting a new car or a new job. We all love to hear good news. That is exactly what the gospel is. It is the good news about the birth, the life, the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. This brings us today to our text found in the letter to the Romans. We're still in the first chapter in verses number 16 through 17.
Yes, sir.
We see now in this particular letter, this particular text, Paul takes a shift from his introduction and thanksgiving, and then he takes the shift to pointing us to the theme of this letter.
Okay.
We see in these two particular verses, these are transitional verses. We demonstrate that it shows that there is a conjunction, the word for, which is used to denote that they still do belong to the introduction of this letter. However, we see that this particular conjunction here points us to the theme of this letter.
Okay.
We see here that Paul begins, he says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel."
Not ashamed.
Although Douglas Moo says that this may be just a mere literary device, we understand that Paul's motive is that the gospel message is something that we ought to be proud of.
Yes, sir. Amen.
This news
This news.
is better than LeBron signing with the Lakers. This news is better than you getting a new job. This news is better than getting a pay raise. This news is better than getting a new house. This news is better than getting a brand new car. This news is better than getting a new spouse. This news is even better than winning the lottery. This news is the best news to be proud of, because this is the good news of God. So what makes this news so proud worthy? The first reason we see that we should be proud of the gospel is because it reveals the power of God. It reveals to us the power of God. Watch the text. It says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God." Now this word power in the original text comes from the Greek word dynamis, which is a manifestation or instance of power or mighty means. This word power literally means the ability to do something or to act in a certain way.
All right.
Watch this. If you don't have the power, then you're not capable of doing it.
Okay.
It is through the gospel that God demonstrates to us his power.
Okay.
So when we look at this power in this text, we discover that there are two aspects seen in the gospel.
Okay.
The first thing we see is the powerlessness of man. Here it is. Salvation is not something that sinners can attain in their own efforts or by their own good works. Salvation is not a joint project where God does his part and now we must do our part. It is not based upon human decision, but rather it is based upon the very power of God alone. We as people are not capable of producing salvation on our own.
Come on, man.
Watch this. We can't do enough. We can't buy enough. We can't pray enough. We can't give enough. We can't sing enough. We can't praise enough. We can't preach enough. We can't even live right enough to ever earn our salvation. There is absolutely nothing that we can ever do on our own to obtain this salvation. But watch this. The second aspect of this power we discover is God's power. The gospel does not tell people about the power of God. Watch this. It is the power of God. God's power is demonstrated in his planning, his performing, and his perfecting of our salvation. God's power is revealed to us through the gospel. God planned it. For the Bible demonstrates that before the foundation of the world, that God had already planned for man's redemption. Watch this. God performed it. He understood that no one was capable of carrying it out, so God veiled his own glory. He took on the form of a man and he satisfied that which was necessary for our salvation. And then God perfects our salvation. It is through the presence and the power of the Holy Spirit in our lives that our salvation is now being worked out in our lives. You see, God did it all by himself. Mankind had nothing to do to work it out. It was God and God all by himself. Some people live their lives like hamsters. A hamster looks on the outside of a glass cage and sees his freedom. He decides that he's going to make a run for it. He gets on the wheel and he runs on the wheel trying to get to his freedom. He soon realizes that he's not going anywhere. So what does he do? He gets on the wheel and he runs a little bit faster. After an hour of running, he realizes that he's still in the same spot. Many of us have been trying to break a habit for years. 10 years have passed and we're still in the same spot. We've made New Year's resolutions to try to quit bad habits or to have better marriages or learn how to work on our finances. But a year later, we're still in the same position. Why does this happen, you guys might ask? Because we're all using the wrong method. You see, we're trapped and we cannot do anything to change ourselves. The only way for the hamster to ever truly get freedom is for the owner of the hamster to reach inside the cage and lift it out. You see, we still ain't seen it yet. Somebody bigger than the hamster has to take over. Trying to get out of a cage situation using your own human effort is just not good enough. But I heard somebody say, but God. But God is bigger. But God is stronger. But God is smarter. But God is wider. We can be proud of the gospel. Because in the gospel we see that God reveals to us His power.
Bring that power out. Amen. Bring it out.
The second reason that we're able to be proud of the gospel is because it reveals God's purpose. Look at it in the text. It reveals God's purpose. Watch this. For the text shows it is the power of God for salvation. This word salvation comes from the Greek word soteria, which is the saving preservation of spiritual and eternal. So watch this. Salvation is the power of God to deliver people from sin. But in order for us to truly understand salvation, we have to really truly understand sin and sin's results. Watch this. Sin is not just breaking the law. But rather, sin is anything that is opposed to or is not in keeping with the nature and the will of God. Amen. Anytime we violate the law, anytime we violate the will, and anytime we violate the nature of God, we engage in sin. Watch this. When Adam violated God's command, he broke the law and he brought sin and the curse of sin. But watch this. When we look at sin, we must understand that there are 5 consequences that we now suffer as a result of sin.
Come on.
The first thing we suffer is a result of our loss of our original righteousness. Amen. Adam and Eve in their original state enjoyed a positive disposition. Yes. This disposition was to do deeds of righteousness. Yes. But because of sin, the desire to do good is now altered to a desire to do evil. Right. Come on. The second result of sin is what we refer to as original guilt. This is not that we feel guilty, but because of the loss of our original righteousness, mankind now stands guilty of breaking God's laws. Yeah. And because we all stand guilty of breaking God's law, we now suffer the result of, now we have to stand for the results of our action. Yeah. You don't got to teach a baby to sin. No. The baby comes into the world knowing how to sin. Amen. But so watch this. The third result of sin is that mankind receive now an original pollution, which is now what we call our sin nature. This is the drive within us that causes us to do evil. Come on. Okay. The fourth result of sin is that now we have an altered image of God. Because of sin, mankind can no longer see God for who God is. Because now we lack the spiritual discernment to truly know anything or be able to recognize or see anything pertaining to God. And so we have the fifth result of sin. This is now what we call spiritual death. This is not the cessation of something that is existing, but rather the spiritual death is what we call the separation of something. You see, when we experience spiritual death, the Bible shows that we are eternally separated from our fellowship with God.
Yes, sir.
So here it is. Watch this. Sin is present in us. It has power over us. And there is a penalty associated with for us because of our sin. So when we talk about the salvation. We refer to it as being rescued from God's wrath. We're being rescued from God's judgment because we deserve to die because of our sin. It is God's means of being delivered from the penalty of sin.
Yeah.
This happens the moment we believe. We're being delivered from the power of sin as we grow in our godliness, and it causes us to be delivered from the presence of sin when we stand before God blameless in the presence of his glory. In October of 1987, a little girl named Jessica McClure fell down an abandoned well shaft. The shaft was 8 inches in diameter and about 24 feet deep. She was lost to her parents with no way to get out of, to ever get out of this well. She was trapped in this little town of Midland, Texas. This little girl became the focus of the whole nation. Every major news network focused on Midland, Texas, and this little girl by the name of Jessica, who was now trapped in this well. For 15 hours, men dug and drilled. They didn't know initially that to get her out, they would have to go through some limestone. This stone cracked the bits of the drill, which were now using, that was making their way through this shaft even more difficult. It took them a lot longer than expected to get this little girl out. After 15 hours, someone was able to get down into the shaft. Someone was able to untangle little Jessica. And someone was able to bring her out to the top. With cameras blazing upon the opening to the shaft, they caught the man bringing Jessica up out of the shaft into the arms of her waiting parents. The sight filled the people with hope and praying, and now everyone was filled with joy. The rescuers were crying. The parents were crying. The newscasters were crying. The onlookers were crying because they all knew that Jessica was going to be dead. But instead of pulling out a dead little girl, they were able to pull out a live little girl. You see, in order for little Jessica to live, somebody else had to save her.
Come on.
The same way every single member of the human race is trapped. We have all fallen into an abyss of sin, and we cannot lift ourselves out. If we're able to get ourselves out of the hole, we're not able to do it on our own. But somebody upstairs had to come down to where we were. Somebody had to drill a hole into the place that we were. Even though we try hard, the hole is just too deep. We cannot climb out. You see, the reason why we ought to be glad for the power of the gospel. The heart of the gospel, we discover that this is what Jesus did. He saw you and me in a hole. We were trying to get out with our good works, but we were unable to get anywhere. But God, coming in the person of Jesus Christ, entered the hole of our death, and he delivered us from the certain death. Amazing grace. How sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. I was blind, but now I see. The reason why we ought to be proud of the gospel, because the gospel message is what reveals to us God's plan. But watch this.
Come on, man.
Not only should we be proud of the gospel because it reveals God's purpose, but we also should be proud of the gospel because it reveals God's plan.
Man. Come on with the plan now.
Look at it. The text says, it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes. First to the Jew and then to the Greek. It is the desire of God that all men be saved. This verse, in fact, removes any racial barriers permitting all people to be saved. Watch this. 1 Timothy chapter 3 shows that it is God's desire that all men be saved. John chapter 1 verse 12 says, but to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become the children of God. So watch, is it contrary to what some people will say, there are no racial qualifiers for salvation.
Come on. Amen.
But we see here in the text that Paul does clarify first to the Jew and then to the Greek. But this was not a matter of priority, but it was just a matter of time.
Okay.
You see, he brought the gospel message to the Jews so they would be able to bring the gospel message to everyone else.
Amen.
Jesus was a Jew.
Yeah, he was.
But that is still not the qualifier. But what is the qualifier? There is a qualifier right here. It says to everyone who believes. So watch this. Salvation is open to everyone who believes.
Amen.
Believing the gospel is the only qualifier for salvation.
Yeah.
But watch this. That word believe in the original text means to be convinced or to have a mental persuasion. In other words, belief is a conscious decision made based upon intellectual persuasion.
Yeah.
And I believe this right here is what's wrong with our salvation experience nowadays.
Okay.
You see, we don't understand that there is a difference between an emotional experience
Yes, sir.
and a mental persuasion.
All right. Okay.
You see, our emotional experience can be altered based upon how we feel.
Yes.
It can be altered based upon what we're going through.
Okay.
It can be altered based upon what you have and what you don't have.
Yeah.
I can feel it today,
Okay.
but tomorrow I might not quite feel it the same way I felt it yesterday.
Yeah. All right.
Well, our emotions can come and our emotions can go.
Yeah.
But our mental persuasion is based upon what you know and what you have been convinced of.
Yeah. Right.
This persuasion must be based solely on the truth of God's word.
Yeah.
You see, our belief is not equal to our feelings. To allow your feelings to guide your belief is like having a truck driver being controlled by the cargo in the truck rather than the wheel that he's used to steering the vehicle.
Yeah.
It is the wheel that controls the cargo and not the cargo that controls the wheel.
Yeah.
We can't rely on how we feel.
Yeah.
Our feelings, our thoughts, and emotions are able to go up and down. Watch this. If you go to a scary movie, you know know that the fact that the monster is not real, but you can still be afraid.
Okay. Yeah.
You can still be scared because the movie makers manipulate your mind so that you begin to feel a reality that's not truly there.
Come on.
You may know that it's not real,
Yeah.
but it still feels like it's real.
Yeah.
Because it feels like it's real, you still get scared. You see, our feelings have no intellect.
Okay.
All our feelings do is react.
Yeah.
Having faith that is not having your belief is not based upon how a person feels.
Yeah.
Watch this. It is God's plan to save those who believe.
All right.
It is not based upon how I feel.
Yeah.
It is not based upon what I get.
Yeah.
It is not based upon what I got.
Yeah.
It is not even based upon what I have.
Yeah.
But my belief is based upon the fact that I know that I know that I know.
Yeah.
It's based upon the fact that I know that Jesus is real. It's based upon the fact that I know that Jesus died for me. It's based upon the fact that I know that he was buried in the grave. It's based upon the fact that I know that he got up with all power in his hands.
Yeah.
Our belief can't be based upon our emotion, but it must be based upon what we know.
But we know.
The final reason for us to be proud of the gospel is because the gospel reveals to us God's product. It's right there in verse number 17. For it is the righteousness of God, and it reveals faith from faith to faith. As it is written, the just shall live by faith.
Yeah.
You see, the product of God's of salvation is the righteousness of God. But watch how this reads. When you read this, if you were to read this in the original text, it does not say the righteousness of God, but it really reads the righteousness that which comes from God.
Okay, come on.
The righteousness that has been done by God.
All right. Yeah.
Watch this. In other words, God is setting right that which was done wrong in his creation.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
That's it.
Our righteousness is not something that we are able to obtain on our own.
All right.
It is not based upon our own human merit, but rather righteousness, God's righteousness has been imputed into us through the gospel.
Yeah.
Amen.
Because of our faith in the gospel. The product that we now receive is that we have now been given God's righteousness.
Yeah.
That is, because of the gospel, we have been declared right with God.
All right.
Yeah.
All right.
You see, the issue with sin is that sin strained our vertical relationship with God.
Yes, sir.
But see, mankind thinks that he is righteous. He thinks that he is acceptable. But man's righteousness cannot produce a righteousness by its own or based upon its own works. But it is through the gospel that God brings to us justification.
Yeah.
It is through the gospel that God unleashes a power to change people and their relationship with him.
Yeah.
When we respond in faith to the message of the gospel, it is then that God justifies us.
Yeah.
What does justification mean? It means that he removes the barrier that exists between us and God.
Yeah.
In other words, our own merit, according to our own merit, we were never worthy to be in a relationship with God.
Come on.
But it is through the gospel that is the good news that God announces to us that God still accepts us anyway.
Yeah.
We ain't heard it yet. It is through the gospel message that even though we were unworthy to have a right relationship with God, it is through the gospel that God announces to us the good news that God accepts us anyway. All we have to do is receive his offer in faith. And the faith that we receive his offer, it must be accompanied by obedience. It is through his justification that he reminds us that our standing with God is based upon not us, but based upon God's amazing grace. The story is told of a king who pardoned two criminals who were headed for death. They were on their way to be killed for their crimes, but he issued a pardon. Both men could now go free. But the reactions of the two criminals were totally different. The first criminal who had been pardoned was full of joy. He was full of excitement and full of exuberance. He was shouting and screaming as he looked at the pardon. What joy to know that I was on my way to death and I had been given life. And not because of anything that I had done. The other criminal stood trembling and thinking, could this really be true? Was this a joke? Nobody would ever do anything like this for me. Look at what I've done. He was terrified rather than having the joy of the first criminal. He felt miserable. In fact, the second criminal even tried to discourage the joy of the first criminal by telling him not to get too excited. He tried to convince him that this might not be real because the first criminal believed the pardon. He had both the assurance and joy of his release. Because the second criminal questioned the pardon. He had neither the joy nor the assurance of the release. You see, one criminal looked at the piece of paper and he held it. And he held the pardon and believed it. The other criminal looked inside of himself to see whether he really believed it. And because of what he saw in himself, he had doubt. And because of his doubt. It took away the joy of his assurance. Blessed assurance. Jesus is mine. Oh, what a foretaste of glory divine. I'm an heir of salvation. I am purchased of God. I have been born of his spirit. And I've been washed in his blood. Some of us still ain't quite seen it yet. But we were dead and dying. We were too mean to live, but not fit to die. We were too grand to waste, but too miserable to save. In spite of it all, we were all still saved by grace. He came down through 40 and 2 generations. He was wounded for our transgression. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and by his stripes we are healed. Somebody say yes today. He died on that old rugged cross. Somebody said he died on that cross. They placed him in a borrowed tomb. He stayed dead all night Friday night. He stayed dead all day Saturday. But early Sunday morning, he got up with all power in his hands. Somebody say yes today. Say yes today. Say yes today. Say yes today. Won't he do it in your life? Won't he fix it in your life? Won't he heal you? Won't he feed you? Won't he clothe you? Won't he put a roof over your head? Put clothes on your back? Put food in your belly? Put money in your pocket? Won't he do it in your life? Somebody say yes today. This is why we have a gospel that we can be proud of. Because when we didn't deserve it, when we messed the whole thing up, God still saw fit to fix it on our behalf. Watch this. We couldn't get it right on our own. It was our doing that got us in this problem. But we took what God gave to us and we messed it up. But in spite of how ignorant we were, in spite of how stupid we were, in spite of how we messed things up, God still saw fit to fix it for us. I am not ashamed of the gospel. As a matter of fact, I'm proud of the gospel. I'm proud of the God that I serve. I'm proud of the God that when I call his name, he will answer. How many of us are glad today to know that we serve a God that saved us? Standing.